afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for coming to our Alabama Archaeological Society Southwest Chapter monthly lecture and meeting. Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Maranda Kles. She's a bioarchaeologist and forensic anthropologist. She earned her Ph.D. from the University of Florida and focused on the examination of the biological relationship of past Native American peoples in relationship to their material culture. Dr. Kles taught at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette for several years and the University of Florida. She is currently the president of Archaeological Consultants Incorporated, or ACI, a Florida-based cultural resource management firm. While at ACI, she is focused on helping clients evaluate and protect cultural resources throughout Florida. This work led to her interest in locating unmarked or forgotten cemeteries. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me, I guess? So we are really still in the beginning stages of a lot of this research. So I have a lot of cool, fun facts, but I don't have a lot of super hard data, but we're working on it. But I thought I would share what we have so far and, you know, just to pique interest and see if maybe I can help answer some questions that others might be interested in, since Alabama has similar WPA records. Let's see if I can make this work. You're not liking me. Ah, there we go. So a lot of my interest in this really actually began for a somewhat selfish business related reason. In February of 2020, they were doing some construction work on I-10 and one of the roundabouts in Jacksonville. And they had brought in dirt to build the on-ramps. And while they were bulldozing the dirt around, out popped several headstones and ultimately numerous skeletal remains. And in the end, it ultimately came back around to that the property they had removed the dirt from was related to the Eastport Colored Cemetery. And this was recorded in the WPA records. The WPA is the Work Progress Administration. So I'll discuss this a little bit more in a minute though. The property where they had done the survey had a full archaeological survey. They had conducted standard shovel testing. It was a good survey, but they did not have this record and they missed the cemetery. And ultimately it ended up on the side of the interstate and caused all kinds of problems for all kinds of people. And as a business, professional liability is very expensive and this does not look good. And so we really started looking into these records and making sure that we were covering our bases to ensure that if there was such an instance, we had at least tried to identify the cemetery. We still miss stuff now and then, but you know, we were at least checking the boxes. So this goes back to the Work Progress Administration. Initially, so the Work Progress Administration is the WPA under Roosevelt, developed during the Great Depression in order to put a lot of people to work. Many people in archaeology are familiar with it because this is how we ended up doing a lot of the mound excavations, was putting people to work as labor for those massive excavations. In 1936, they commissioned the Historical Records Survey, and as part of the Federal Writers Project, which the Federal Writers Project went around and recorded all kinds of different facts and things. You can find state histories and all kinds of stuff. And later, the Historic Records Survey kind of became its own division. And I guess their official mission statement, I found out today, was discovery, preservation, and listing of basic materials for research in the history of the United States. So pretty broad. You find a subject you're interested in, and I guess they could research it. And one of the projects that they did was the Veterans Grave Registration. And so it occurred throughout the United States. And they did the registration in Florida in 1940-41. But basically they went around and they were basically trying to locate all of the veterans' graves for the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I, and record the veterans' names, their rank, military, cemetery location, etc. And in doing so, they actually recorded the location of numerous cemeteries that did not contain veterans. The Florida survey was initiated pretty late, like I said, 1940, 41. And unfortunately, it got cut short because of the mobilization for World War II. And so they did not finish compiling all of the records. And so in the end, we actually don't have 16 counties. Supposedly there's records out there, but they never made it to the repository. And so we don't know where they are. Another research project for another day. But 51 counties ultimately were recorded. Those are divided between 10 volumes. And the very beginning sort of details how they go about this, but it seems that a lot of people were volunteering to help. So members of the American Legion, veterans of foreign wars, sons and daughters of the Confederacy, sons and daughters of the American Revolution, the American Red Cross, and often local National Guard units would go out and find the cemeteries, write down the directions, write down the veterans' information, all kinds of things, and come back with it. In some other places, you'll actually find little index cards, and I don't know if Florida originally had those cards. I've never seen them. I've only got the final product, but it would have the veteran's name and the war and all kinds of other information. And some states even have full map plats of these cemeteries in them. New York is one example. We don't seem to have that in Florida. The records suggest they exist, but we don't know where they are. So this is what we do end up with, are these records. And so you can see here, these are the cemetery names. This is just from one county. And so it will say, you know, Brevard County, and then it'll list all the cemeteries that they recorded in the county. And then you scroll down and you get the list of all the veterans in that county, which you can see there. And it tells you the war they were in, their rank, their organizations, born, died, and the plat and grave that they're associated with. So, and as I said, some states have maps and other things, which Florida did not seem to. Initially, what we did was one of my historians PDF'd all of these volumes were PDF'd. She turned it into the searchable PDF so that we could just type in like Township 27 and it would search Township 27. But you can see from the typeface up there, it was not perfect. And so we realized that we were going to have to start, you have to search by section 14 and then 1 and then 27. And you would find the same one multiple times, but sometimes you'd find a new one that matched because the typeface just didn't match in one of the other searches. And so we started out that way, but we quickly realized that that was going to take an eternity. And so we started having to work through this in a much more systematic fashion. Because we realized very quickly that there are a number of things wrong. Every so often they would have the wrong township, but the correct section and range, or vice versa. You might have the right section, but the wrong township. They wandered around. I don't know how they, you know, got home every day because they seemed lost to me. And we did notice that certain counties were more accurate than others. Some counties were way off. Also, we noticed several times where they would say a lot of these directions, as you can see, you know, from the railroad crossing in the town of Newport, proceed north 6 3/10 miles, et cetera, et cetera. And every so often they would forget the tenths. And so it would say proceed north 5 miles instead of 5/10 of a mile. And so if you don't pick up on that, right, you end up in the wrong place. Every so often we find north and south or east and west or right and left reversed. Because you'll follow it to where they say and you're like, it's not here, and then you kind of work your way backwards the other way and you're like, oh, well, they mixed it up at one point. And a lot of the historic roadways and reference features are gone. So let's see, 5A, well, State Road 19 is no longer State Road 19. Actually it is, it's US 19 now, but a lot of times we'll find like State Road 5 is now, you know, US 27. So it's the names that were used do not match the names that we know today. The Snow Hill one, the Snow Hill Colored School is long gone. It's not present. And most of the other features that they use, the Geneva Chalot Highway also is renamed something else. And so you have to dig back through the records just to reconstruct where to even start your search. And so we did this. And then another thing that we found was absolute directions versus sort of approximate cardinal directions. Their favorite thing to say was go east. But really, once you look at a map or you look at an aerial, you realize that they were actually kind of going northeast, right? And so if you go the wrong way, you're going to end up in the wrong spot. And so again, a lot of variability by county. Some counties were really accurate, others not so much. So we sat down and basically started doing this much more systematically. We started at volume 0 and just worked our way through reading every single set of cemetery directions, and working our way through it. So she would often start with the section township range and would just go there on Google Earth and see if there was a cemetery already there, right? Which happened a lot. They were already there, fantastic. And we would work backwards just to double check that the things sort of lined up and the names matched, because once in a while the name we had did not match the name that is now recorded. So the names would change through time. And so we would, that's sort of the first crash course check. If that didn't pan out, we often would have to go check the historic roadway maps to just get ourselves onto the Geneva Colot Highway, because that name does not exist any longer. We would also then turn to the 1940s and 50s census records, particularly the 1940 census enumeration records, because the 1940s is when they were doing this survey, so a lot of those line up. But the census records have everybody's name and everything. The enumeration maps are I'll show you one in a little bit, but they're the maps that have all the towns and the roads, and a lot of times they'll show State Road 5, which is not called that anymore. And they also will draw the cemeteries on there. Or a lot of directions start from the post office, but we all know the post office has moved how many times. And so you can figure out where the post office was and start your directions from it. Historical topographic maps and historic soil survey maps also came in really handy. And then the last resort often was historic aerials. The University of Florida has an extensive collection of 40s and 50s aerials, but they can be sometimes really hard to georeference and to get you into the right space. But we would turn to those at the end of the day if we needed to, especially when going straight east wasn't working. We would need to check those old aerials and see if we were going southeast or northeast instead. And then every so often the deed records come in handy. We'll pull out the 18 and 1900s deeds and try and figure out who owned what piece of land where. Those definitely are harder to search by county. Some counties go all the way back, and other counties you have to literally go to the paper records. So we don't use that nearly as often. This is an example of a historic soil survey map. These are actually housed at the University of Alabama. They have an online database for Florida, and they actually also have the Alabama ones by county. And so you can see the cemetery. This is the common indicator for a cemetery, right? Pretty straightforward. It looks like a cemetery. But they also note churches on here as well. And I actually know that this church has a cemetery with it that was forgotten over time. Yes.
What a cemetery is located, there's a building that they built on top of that cemetery,
Mm-hmm.
and the names was not put out there accurate at all.
Yes.
It's like really forgotten.
Yes, and that's exactly what happened here. Was this church is here, and actually the WPA records take you to that cemetery. It was there in the 40s. It was gone by the 50s. But over here there are not cemeteries associated with those two little church symbols. So we toyed around with putting all the churches on the map, but at the end of the day we would end up with thousands upon thousands of churches that would be dead ends. But we will often follow the WPA directions, and even if there is not a cemetery on the soil survey map, if there's a church, we go ahead and put the cemetery there because we're using the WPA directions. So it's a good backup. These are the census enumeration maps, and so you can see it gives you the census districts, right, that they're using. This road runs out here. This is the town of Zellwood and the town of Tangerine. And here we have the Tangerine Cemetery. There's actually a cemetery in Zellwood with this church, and there's actually another cemetery down here that isn't even marked on this map. And we actually found in this one that all the names have gotten mixed up. And so when you actually look at the Florida Master Site File and other records, they call this one the Zellwood Cemetery and they call this one the Tangerine Cemetery, even though the towns are reversed. So it's a whole debacle, trying to sort out all of the names and associations. But ultimately, none of these resources is perfect. It's putting all the resources together to get some semblance of competence. Once we've narrowed down locations, right now we have built the database. I'm going to run some numbers in a little bit and tell you how many cemeteries, etc. We've dumped all of this in, and right now, whenever I'm doing background research for a project, so I have a client that comes to me and says they want to build a subdivision or something, we check our database. Do we think there's a cemetery there based on our research? And then as those come up, we will basically fact check them. We can't just run around fact checking all of them, but we plan to make the database available so that others can try to do this. But some of the resources that we have used on a few instances are LiDAR, which is a light detection. They basically fly over and it's kind of like GPR with radar in the ground. It's light reflecting. But this is a cemetery here and you can see the graves almost perfectly on this LiDAR. This is actually an African-American cemetery and most likely started as part of a plantation cemetery in the Tallahassee area. And the way that it was maintained, they did a lot of, I believe it's called scarping, where they rake the cemetery. That maintains these subtle divots that if you were standing in the cemetery, you might not really truly appreciate, but with the LiDAR technology, you can. But in other cemeteries where they've been maintained in a more park-like environment, right, where it's encouraged to be level, you don't see this as effectively. We actually did one where the African-American cemetery was on one side of the road and the white cemetery was on the other side of the road, and you can actually see the difference in the LiDAR. You could see the graves over here very nicely, and over here you couldn't see much except the headstones because they've been maintained in two different fashions. So we will pull the LiDAR, but it doesn't always work, but it's cool when it does. We work with another company to do GPR, so ground penetrating radar, to look for those cemetery signatures. We have gone out and done human remains detection dogs to search for graves. Unfortunately, this one, the cemetery is behind the dog. And we were trying to see if there was graves out here that had been lost. But the dog was too confused by the cemetery scent. It was too close. But they're gonna keep a wide berth of the cemetery just to be safe, thankfully. And then as an absolute last resort, we will sometimes resort to excavation. Because at the end of the day, the LiDAR isn't perfect and the GPR isn't perfect. And if I'm going to tell somebody that they can't develop the land, you know, we need to be somewhat certain. I don't go around and dig up if there's 20 GPR hits. I don't dig up 20 GPR things. I only dig up 1 or 2 to confirm that they are graves and immediately rebury and etc. But that's only if there's nothing clearly there.
My next question is, when you're doing the GPRs on old cemeteries, like mine was established in 1902.
Mhm.
We know there's graves outside of the cemetery.
Mhm.
And like if we get a hard rain here in Mobile and we sit on 8 Mile Creek, they do wash up. People have their homes on there.
Yeah.
In fact, I went to elementary school built on grave. Sorry. But we're trying to find out who did these graves belong to, because nobody kept a good ledger on the history. And that's been very helpful.
Yes, and it's a couple people have done some extensive work in Tampa, and it's a lot of going through the newspapers and finding either the obituary or the death mentions, and then getting in touch with those old funeral homes and trying to see if they have those old records. But it's very labor intensive, detailed work. We haven't done a lot of that, but it's one of the steps we know we'll need to eventually do. It's hard to find all those records sometimes.
Quick question. How much would it cost for the people in Florida to come to Mobile at the Colored Cemetery and do the VR tracking on in the cemetery?
The GPR?
Yeah, GPR.
It varies on like how big the area is and stuff, but we can talk afterwards, cause
Yes.
the company we work with is all over, and if they can't come here, I'm certain that they can recommend somebody that would be very good, so that you can, get some ideas. Yeah. So ultimately, we hope that over time we'll help confirm more of these locations that have been lost or forgotten or erased intentionally. But it's gonna take time. So a couple of the examples that I have, that we have worked through. So this is the 5A cemetery. 5A was a, lumber town. It was called 5A because the 5 men that own the lumber town's last names all started with A, so 5-A is how it started, and it became 5A. And down the road, there's actually a 5A junction, which is different, and that becomes a very big deal when you have to read all of these newspaper articles to figure out where people are buried. And so from the railroad crossing in Newport Richey, you're supposed to go up State Road 19, 6 3/10 miles to this intersection with State Road 210, and then go east. And then north 1/10 of a mile, so that's getting us to here. We go north 1/10 of a mile, and then you go east along Woods Road 3/10 of a mile, and then walk northwest through the woods for approximately 100 yards. But they couldn't see anything. And this was actually the first time that we realized that east was not necessarily east. So you can see my line goes a little northeast. There's actually a road here. Do you see the road back there? And so the first time that we looked at the directions, my historian just went straight east and put us out here for the cemetery. And that area had already been tested, GPR'd, and developed. And so they were saying, oh, the cemetery's not here. And it's like, well, actually, you were looking in the wrong place. And so it's in here somewhere. We're not sure exactly where. And you can see the path, and you can see there's a couple of paths here that go through the woods. There's actually a very subtle one right there, and there's another one that comes up through here into these areas that are slightly cleared. And so this is that forgotten element. So this cemetery was probably buried between 1900 and 1910, and then there's nothing in it after that. And so it was by 1940 erased, right? 30 years of absence, and then going into present times even further. And so trying to reconstruct these locations, because often we'll see in another one where we can see the cemetery, it's right there, right? But on this one, it's very unclear. And we actually ran LiDAR. We could not find grave signatures. The area had been too heavily altered, but look at that right there. That's that road. Over 100 years old, right? And you can still see the path in certain areas, and you can actually still somewhat see the trails that were going up into those cleared areas. So in the end, we think the cemetery is somewhere in this area. We GPR'd all of this and excavated numerous anomalies in this location and couldn't find anything that was consistent with a cemetery. So we think it's still over here in this undeveloped property. There's actually now a church here. And so it's been marked. The city, the county, the state, they're all well aware. And so if somebody tries to develop it in the future, they'll end up having to have the survey done of their property. And so we shall see. But our client in the end sort of got off easy, I guess. Another project that we did was the roadless cemeteries. These are in Tampa. And the roadless cemetery is along the corner of Sly and 30th. The WPA actually says roadless cemetery, and they give you a section township range, but there's no directions, but just nothing. It's just blank, which happens every so often, but not often. It was kind of funny. And so we knew that we were in the right area. And a few years earlier, USF and the Florida Public Archaeology Network had come out and done this GPR survey. Over here, there's a little walled area with tombstones and things. It's very obvious. But the question was, how big is this cemetery? We think it's bigger. And so they GPR'd this particular area and found more graves. We ended up GPRing out here and did not find any graves. And this is the LiDAR. It's not great, but you can see some subtle depressions in here that are indicative of possible graves. And then when you get out here, you're getting into trees and other things. So the LiDAR and the GPR matched up nicely, which was kind of cool. But in doing the research for the cemetery, we were trying to establish roughly how many people were buried there. And this is when I learned some of the previous research with, there was numerous graves associated with the cemetery on Find a Grave. However, there were no tombstones or headstones associated. And it turns out that there was a gentleman who had done extensive research looking through funeral records, newspaper articles, and documenting names that were associated with cemeteries and getting them recorded on Find a Grave to at least have that out there, which was really helpful. But we found out that this roadless cemetery was also called the Brickyard Cemetery. So we found 1 or 2 newspaper articles referencing individuals being buried in the Brickyard Cemetery. But as we were doing this research, we started coming across the Roadless Pond Cemetery, and it tracked a little bit earlier in time than Roadless Brickyard. So it's very confusing. Roadless was a Cuban origin family, big name in the Tampa area. And there's quite a few of them. They own land all over the area. And so we started sort of tracking the Roadless Pond Cemetery burials and the Roadless Cemetery burials and trying to match all these things up. And then we actually looked at the WPA records, and WPA records took you to a Catholic church cemetery. And later it turns out that it was the Zion Cemetery, which was lost sometime in the late 1940s, early 1950s. They ended up building housing development on top of it. And then when they went to tear the housing development down, they found the cemetery. And they've been doing a lot of documentation and work to sort of bring that back into present knowledge. So we were able to sort of distinguish Roadless Pond from Roadless in helping our client understand what was going on. But a little bit later in time, we start getting the Roadless Tract Cemetery, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And so we started tracking that when it shows up much later, like in the 1840s and 50s. And then later it eventually gets called the Ridgewood Cemetery. And this one just truly horrified me, unfortunately. The Ridgewood Cemetery was set up for burials in like the 30s. And then in 57, the city is trying to sell the land to a developer. And somebody says, hey, there's a cemetery there. Somebody needs to take care of the cemetery. You can't just build on this. And so they pulled back the deal. But you follow the newspapers through in late 58, early 59, the city is actually buying the land back from a developer. And they eventually build King High School on top of it, on top of the cemetery. So they literally forgot a cemetery in less than 12 months. So it was rather horrific. And there's well over 200 or 300 burials in it. A ton of them are associated with the WPA. Veterans, there's veterans graves, so not only are we, desecrating veterans, but African-American veterans and Civil War veterans and all of these things that, so it's very interesting. The high school is still there. They haven't torn it down, but they know that there's a cemetery there. So hopefully someday they will rectify that situation. But sorting out the common names and trying to piece together these histories to understand them was an important factor. Another cemetery we came across was the Hudgens Cemetery. And so from Mount Enon Road and West Shiloh Road at Plant City, you go 3/10 of a mile to a house on Hudgens Place, right? And the grave is out behind the cemetery, or out behind the house. This is like a single burial. There's one guy, maybe two, but one guy for sure. This is the area now. This is I-4, which is a major interstate like I-10, right? So, and you can see there's no Mount Enon. There's actually Mount Enon Church over here. But trying to figure out where in the world we are. Thankfully, we found an old highway map, and we've got the old railroad right there. And then right there, we've got the Mount Enon Shiloh Road. So we were able to re-reference ourselves off of that. And then we had to get into the deed records, and Blocker was the name of the veteran that was buried there. And so this is Blocker right here. And we also have land for Blocker here. In the end, Blocker wasn't buried in his own land though. Not real sure where he was buried. But when we follow the directions for the WPA, we end up over here somewhere. There's a house here and a house here. So we're not sure which house, which is actually south of this land here. The Blockers owned some further south as well. So we think that probably the Hudgens were renters at the time in the 40s when the WPA came along. And so they referenced the name of the people living there at the time, as opposed to the family that probably originated the cemetery. And I think they're renters because we can't find land records anywhere with that name on it. And we couldn't connect all the dots neatly. So in the end, we have not confirmed the location. We're still waiting for an opportunity to do that, but we've at least narrowed it down to this approximate area as opposed to unknown altogether. Snow Hill Cemetery is so from the town of Snow Hill, which there still is a small town of Snow Hill. You take the Geneva Highway, which doesn't get called that anymore now, it's Snow Hill Road, to the Snow Hill Colored School on the east side of the highway, and then you turn south and go a quarter mile and then east a mile. And so we had to go through a lot of records, but in the end, this right here is the Buddha schoolhouse, SH, Buddha Schoolhouse. And it turns out that Buddha was the original Snow Hill schoolhouse. And so then it became Snow Hill later through time. So we were able to figure out roughly where the schoolhouse was in order to get ourselves there. Because there is still a church up here. The Snow Hill Church is right there. But when you take the directions, you end up out here in the middle of nowhere. So there's a Snow Hill School. And that was what we believe was the location of the school at the time when they were there, based on looking at those aerials. And so we know that when you go south, it might be true, but then going east a mile, you know, did they go straight east or did they go all the way down here east? We ended up finding deed records that indicated that the Flowers deeded an acre for the cemetery. And we think it's this acre here, which is slightly more than a mile. But it lines up with a trail. This was the Reverend. He owned this land here and lived here for a long time. And so we think this is his trail coming up and tending to this cemetery area. They later had moved everything over to here. But after the 40s, the trail kind of disappears. He had moved away. It was forgotten. This is another instance in which it's a single burial in the property. We're still waiting to go back in GPR and try to confirm the exact location in order to help protect that. But again, reviewing all of the deed records over time to try and reconstruct who owned what, where, when, why, how, to better understand that history. This was an instance, we're actually still working on this project. This is the cemetery right here. This is actually on a 50s aerial. So it's still pretty visible. The directions lead you right to it. It's a post office, head north kind of deal. And it takes you right to this location, which is always really nice to have. But now you can't see it at all. They actually bulldozed everything and turned it into a racetrack at one point for a little while. And then sort of turned it back into pasture. And we went out and we've done GPR survey. And so these are the GPR results. These are the blue are probable graves. So meaning that multiple hits in a row spanning roughly 6 feet, or they have a stronger signature. The pink ones are possible. And it usually means the signal's a little weaker or it's not as long. So they have more questions. I'm good bones, but they're not really identifiable. Did do an excavation and I'm pretty sure we hit the edge of a casket. That's a nice casket handle. These are probably arm bones, possibly buttons. Another shovel test, we had nails and bones. And so we ultimately, you know, we rebury all those things and mark the location. We notify the state as required. And so at that point, we did not test any of these that are here. We've now been going back and testing some of these more peripheral ones because at the end of the day, the developer wants to develop around it. And so trying to, you know, find as nice an edge as we can and still be respectful, is sort of the goal at the moment.
The plus one.
Yes. The red ones were, human remains or bone, and these were, I think, negative anomalies that he had tested those and didn't find anything. But this one got even more interesting as we proceeded into it, because, sorry, this was my rough draft image, super quick, that I threw together for you. Let's just pretend this is the section that we're dealing with, and then the quarter sections. We have all the deed records for all of these things. This is roughly the cemetery location. We usually find them in the corners. They're usually in the corner of a section. So this is somebody's deed here. They don't usually stick a cemetery right in the middle like that. They usually put them at the corners, right? Because like the Smiths and the Jones and the Bobs would all share it. So it'd probably be closer to the corner of their properties, right? So it was kind of a weird location, which made me start out with what's going on here. And then looking at the archaeological record, we realized that Abrams Newtown was recorded just south of where I was. So not in the property I'm in, but south of there. And it's a general vicinity location. They don't know the exact location of Abrams Newtown. But what we do have are a bunch of deed records from the late 1800s. And when they described the deeds, they said from Abrams Newtown, go north X number of miles, and you are at the southwest corner of this deed. Now go north and east, west, that's your deed, right? And so they referenced those settlers' deeds off of Abrams Newtown. And Abrams Newtown was a Black Seminole village. So there was an Abrams Old Town, and that was destroyed during the Seminole Wars. And they resettled into Abrams Newtown. It was also they were eventually run out as well. But it's definitely a coming together population. The Seminoles would pass through. There's a very large African-American, formerly enslaved, freed individuals that are working together. They're interacting with US soldiers. There are all these different things. And they got me wondering, why would you put a cemetery here unless there wasn't already a cemetery there, right? That's one of the premises often is, you know, if I'm trying to find an historic cemetery, even though the markers here only go back to 1850, you know, why did they choose this spot in 1850? Maybe it's because they already knew that there were burials from 1840 or 1830 or whatever, right? And so it really started getting me very paranoid about this prospect, because this is in a hammock area. It's just north of where the Seminole village was. They tend to try to distance themselves from the dead, and they often bury in hammock areas, right? And so started into the conundrum of what would a Seminole burial, African-American burial look like in comparison to our settler burials that are coming along later. And so we've actually gone back and we're doing additional GPR, and I was like, anything that even remotely hits, let's do a test on, especially on the peripheries, just to make sure that we're not going to miss one of these Seminole burials that might not look like a grave burial, right? Because that would be a whole other catastrophe. So it's interesting how the two intersect. And so they're actually doing this work now, so I'm waiting on results to see what more we learn. But it was an interesting overlap where we started to recognize that the cemetery location is not in what we normally expect to be the location. And so why becomes the question. And so overall, the Florida WPA recorded a total of 1,931 cemeteries. And remember, we're missing 16 counties. So there's probably quite a few more. The Historic Soil Survey maps actually identified 51 more cemeteries that did not correspond to a WPA. And interestingly, they actually identified 11 mounds. They say Indian mound on them that are not currently on the state database. So we're trying to get that sorted out. The 1940s and 50s census enumeration maps identified another 288 cemeteries. And then just in trying to cross-reference things and search records, we actually found another 112 cemeteries on topo maps. And we haven't even searched all the topos, because that's a very tedious process. She just happened to recognize them as she was searching for other things and flagged them. So the WPA cemeteries often would show up on these other locations as well. So the Florida Master Site File, which is the database that records all the archaeological and historic resources in Florida, had roughly 848 records that appear to correspond to WPA cemeteries, which means that little over 1,083 of just the WPA are not in the Florida Master Site File. We haven't even had a chance to cross-reference the other ones to see what is or is not in the Florida Master Site File. And then ultimately, of those 1,900 cemeteries, 394 of them had a notation of colored in some way, whether it was colored private, white and colored. We see it numerous times. And so we also found that 91 cemeteries had a regular cemetery and then a colored cemetery. So LaGrange and then LaGrange. And you can see the section, township, range are identical. At the end of the day, this one you go from Dixie Highway in the town of LaGrange 3 3/10 miles north. And this one you go 3 2/10 miles north. And we found in almost every instance where they would give them separate directions. So it was clearly understood to be separate, right? And this has come up a few times when we've been looking for historic cemeteries and there is a concern that there is a separate segregated cemetery. And it's not 100% accurate, but we have pointed back to the WPA records in which they frequently did note a separate. And so if we have one, but the WPA didn't note a second one, it's likely because it wasn't recognized as separate. Maybe it was part of, but again, we don't stake our career on it, but we use it as a data point. Based on our research, we have about 1,853 cemeteries that we feel pretty good about, either an exact location because you can see it, or it's still a cemetery. And then the rest of them are sort of approximate locations that we feel really good about based on the directions, et cetera. About 78 of them were uncertain. Either the directions are just so wildly inaccurate, we can't follow them, or the landscape has changed so drastically that it's just really difficult for us to ascertain absolutely. We're still trying to narrow down some of those in more detail. Of the 394 likely African-American cemeteries, 130 of them have an approximate location. So only 67% do we have an exact, whereas for all others, which almost all of them are probably white, but there was one that was listed as Native American and one that was listed as Jewish. So I lumped them in. 72% of those have an exact location, meaning we can see them. We know they're there. We're certain of their presence. But it does seem that there's a roughly equal number that have gone missing between the two. 57% seems to be unaccounted for in either category. But again, this is still just the beginning review. I suspect that if we look more closely at it, we're going to see a difference in development patterns, in that a lot of these missing white cemeteries are probably still out in rural environments. They're probably in the back of somebody's farm, whereas more of the missing African-American cemeteries are probably in urban environments that have been built over. So that's one of the things I kind of want to look at is, you know, missing versus erased in understanding these records. And so, you know, I do have some concerns about the accuracy, because I feel like out of 1,900 cemeteries, less than 400 being listed as African-American seems awfully low in Florida, in my opinion. So, you know, I kind of wonder if there isn't, you know, some selective recordation of what's going on in some of these areas. You know, maybe, or maybe by the time that the WPA was doing this, a lot of them had already been erased and forgotten, and the residents that would have known of their locations were no longer there to point to them. So, you know, it's not a perfect system, but it is a great place to start. You know, trying to fill in these gaps. So definitely doing those alternative sources, going from the WPA records to the soil surveys, to the census maps, to the topos, to try and piece down all of these things. And I imagine that a bunch of those that are on the soil surveys, because those soil surveys tend to be like 1905, 1919, they tend to be earlier. I imagine a lot of those may end up lining up with forgotten, erased, destroyed African American cemeteries over time. So, so we'll see. There's a lot to still research. Westchester, New York has really great records, as does South Dakota and Ohio. Westchester actually has maps. They're the ones with the really nice plat maps. These other ones you can search by name, you can search by county, cemetery name, and come up with a variety of answers. Florida's, it's really just these PDFs that are available for you to search. We have not gotten to the next step. Alabama, according to this guide, which I've got the link in here, I can send this to Jen later. Alabama does have the records, but apparently they're unpublished. So I don't know what state they're in, but they exist, and apparently you can go see them somewhere. But I did check I looked at a couple of census enumeration maps, saw a couple cemeteries on them. I did pull up the historic soil surveys in Alabama and just looked at 1 or 2 counties and flipped through real quick. And I see cemeteries on there as well. So it's very similar. And then the last resource we did use a lot was Find a Grave to check cemetery names. Sometimes if it gave us the name of somebody, we would run that through Find a Grave to try and, cross-check results. And every so often Find a Grave would have the answer that we did not have. We actually found one page of the Sumter County survey missing, and Find a Grave had 3 of the 4 graves on it. So we were able to go back and figure out what graves were on the page that was missing, and we now have 3 of them. We don't know where the 4th one is yet. We're trying to get a copy of the page. So that's what I've got for you.